the physical encounter was with mostly initially with giant cuttlefish. I mean, one should picture these animals. They're big animals, 2 feet to 3 feet long in some cases, continually changing color. They can produce just about any color. There are a few shades they don't seem to quite manage. Dark blue, I think they're still working on, but pretty much anything else. And they just run through these extraordinary color and pattern changes in front of you or just for their own reasons. They also have a kind of inquisitive orientation to divers, and especially snorkelers in some cases. If you put your hand with the glove off somewhere where they can reach, sometimes they'll just touch you once and then back off again. A sort of moment of curious contact, and then they're back off again. There are other situations where you're in the water with the animal and in a very puzzling way, the animal is just determined not to recognize your existence. You know, you do not exist from their point of view.
One of the things that I'm most looking forward to speaking about with you today is your writing on animal welfare in Living on Earth, your recent book. But before we get to that, I thought we ought to start with animal minds. And maybe before we even get to that, I'd like to hear about how you got into these subjects. So what came first, scuba diving or aquatic animal minds?
The crucial event was a kind of meeting of the philosophical side and the scuba diving side in a way that seems odd to me now. I'd spent decades thinking about evolution and life and to some extent, and the mind, and to some extent animal minds, simpler sorts of minds. But I didn't know any particular animals that well. There was no group of animals who I felt I really understood a little bit. And then at a certain stage, I began spending a bit more time in Australia. I was still working in the US and began coming back in the northern summers and began diving and snorkeling in a particular patch of water, a small sanctuary near Sydney, and encountered giant cuttlefish, not for the very first time, but the first time I'd spent time with them. I knew what they were and immediately thought, okay, this is an amazing animal. I have to learn about this animal. I then encountered octopuses in the same water, and there's a lot more known about octopuses than giant cuttlefish. So although the physical encounter was with mostly initially with giant cuttlefish, I mean, one should picture these animals. They're big animals, 2 feet to 3 feet long in some cases, continually changing color. They can produce just about any color. There are a few shades they don't seem to quite manage. Dark blue, I think they're still working on, but pretty much anything else you will see. And they just run through these extraordinary color and pattern changes in front of you or just for their own reasons. They also have a kind of inquisitive orientation to divers, and especially snorkelers in some cases. You can tell there's a lot of something going on inside. So I thought, right, these guys are important. They're important because they're so complicated and so spectacular, but also so distant from us in evolutionary terms. The common ancestor was very far back, very simple, and that made them seem an important animal. So from that point on, my philosophical work connected with the actual experiences with wildlife, especially in the water, especially scuba diving. And that sequence of events really changed the path of my career.
One, it's surprising that of all the colors, the cuttlefish haven't managed to get down dark blue, because one would assume to the extent that this is a useful tool for camouflage, I know it's also useful for communication, but you'd think that in the ocean, dark blue would be a good color to have in your repertoire.
Yeah, the camouflage colors that they're really good at are sort of seaweed type colors and sand colors. I mean, it's amazing watching one of these animals. They look like a kind of jet propelled octopus turtle hybrid sometimes, and they're sort of cruising across the reef. And as they go over the top of seaweed, they'll be a kind of blotchy green. Then they'll cross a patch of sand and they're just immediately sand colored. So those are the great camouflage colors. And then you have a lot of reds and oranges and yellows and dark colors, greens, which, no one really knows why they're producing that kind of range of colors. Some of it is for, I think, intraspecific signaling, competition. Some of it's probably meant to startle potential threats. There are some weird patterns they do when they're hunting. But these are quite mysterious animals.
Just to give some context for our listeners, if they want to read your books, I mean, what we're talking about right now, Cuttlefish, we'll get to Octopuses, Consciousness Minds, that's contained in Other Minds. And then this is part of a trilogy, Metazoa being the second book, and Living on Earth being the third, which, we'll get to eventually. But one of the things that I was taken with in Other Minds is all of these stories of scuba diving and interactions with cuttlefish and octopuses. And it is very clear that you form you describe them as kind of alien creatures, but you still form a relationship with some of them. And I think it would be interesting just to hear one or two stories from your scuba diving career that might make more salient for our listeners why you just were so interested in the other minds of these creatures.
Sure. There's a combination of phenomena involving contact and recognition and phenomena involving a kind of deep separation. I found that extremely interesting. The fact that some giant cuttlefish would have an interest in me. I gave some of them names based on their sort of bodily designs and their color preferences.
Artists' names.
Yeah, Matisse was a specialist in very bright kind of washes of color, especially yellow. There's one called Kandinsky.
Brancusi.
Favored red. And then Brancusi was more of a sort of body shape specialist than a color specialist. And in some of these cases, you really felt you had some contact with them. On a few occasions, I'd reach out a hand cautiously, and the animal would reach. I don't like to touch them if they're just in a particular position, but if you put your hand with the glove off somewhere where they can reach, sometimes they'll just touch you once and then back off again. A sort of moment of curious contact, and then they're back off again. And that, of course, was always very exciting. There are other situations where you're in the water with the animal, and in a very puzzling way, the animal is just determined not to recognize your existence. You do not exist from their point of view. You can plant yourself right in front of them, a big animal, bigger than them, and they'll do everything they can to avoid, not that they're aggressive, it's just, you are not here. You are not part of my environment, which I did find interestingly disconcerting. Mm-hmm. And I think that combination, the sort of moments of contact, of curiosity, and the moments of a kind of profound refusal to recognize, I think they capture the combination of, familiarity and alienness to some extent.
At the risk of coming off as too effusive, this isn't a compliment that one can usually give to philosophers, but your writing is extremely engaging and lucid. And speaking of this idea that some of the cuttlefish seem determined not to see you as existing, there's a very memorable passage where I don't recall which cuttlefish this is, but you describe yourself as feeling almost like a ghost who doesn't realize that he's a ghost because the cuttlefish just won't notice you.
Right.
Right. But also, you mentioned that Brancusi is a shape specialist. I had always known that cuttlefish were geniuses with color, but the way that you describe the various shapes they will make with their 8 arms, so horns or sickles, and you describe them as kind of coming at you like medieval siege weapons, something like that.
Right.
It's very, very interesting to read.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So just, again, to give our listeners a little bit of context, I have done a couple of episodes about animal minds recently. I've spoken with Michael Graziano about this. I've spoken with Ned Block a bit about this. And I'm very interested in it from the lens of animal welfare. So my idea in talking about other minds is to first start speaking about just that, other minds, and then we'll see how it connects to animal welfare. But before we get to the minds, I think the brains come first.
Right.
And what is it, or what are some of the main reasons that creatures evolved brains to begin with?
Well, we should start by just thinking about nervous systems, even before we get to brains. And almost all animals have a nervous system of some sort. Not quite all. There are a couple of exceptions, and sponges are the sort of well-known exception. There's also another odd exception. Why did animals evolve nervous systems? We don't really know, of course. It was a long time ago. We're probably talking close to 600 million years or so ago. But I think a reasonable picture has a narrative a bit like this. We start thinking about just single-celled organisms, not bacteria, but single-celled eukaryotic organisms, larger and more complex cells that make up bodies like ours. Things like paramecia. Now, if you look at a paramecium through a microscope or other single-celled eukaryotic organisms, they're very active. They're not just sitting there on a plate like bacteria. They can move, they can swim, they attack each other, basically. So if you think about the world before animals even existed, a reasonable picture is one in which there were single-celled eukaryotes leading active, somewhat belligerent lives. Now, in that context, there's a size advantage. If you can get big, you become harder to engulf. A few biologists have thought that a size advantage was an important factor at this stage. John Bonner way back, Jochen Brox more recently. So you start forming colonies and collections of various kinds, partly for that reason, and perhaps also for other reasons. Now, because you're not plants, you're not algae, you're not able to photosynthesize, you're a different kind of being. In most cases, you're going to have to work out eventually how to act, how to do things in order to get food, and do so on this new scale of the larger multicellular organism. And I think that some of the early stages in animal evolution, if you look at the fossil record, the fossils we have suggest the animals were doing hardly anything. A lot of them were anchored to the seafloor. But this is before the Cambrian explosion. This is late in the period before that. They're the beginnings of what look like mobility and activity, the evolution of the left-right symmetrical or bilaterian body form that we have and octopuses have and most animals have. And in order to make action possible at all, you have to coordinate the activities of all these cells. And I think a reasonable picture of early nervous systems is one in which their initial role was coordinative, just pulling the body together, making action possible. Also responding to sensory events, because there aren't too many actions that are unconditionally good. Most actions are good in this circumstance, not good in that circumstance, so you have to work out which condition you're in, and that's where the senses come in. So you have an integrative device connect to sensing, which becomes more elaborate, and that's a plausible story about the beginning of nervous systems, and it's a story about why they're present early and in almost all animals. A brain is a central nervous system, basically, or the central part of a nervous system, the part where you've clustered lots and lots of neurons, nerve cells, together as a central controller, often between the eyes of the animal. And that kind of centralization has evolved independently a number of times. It's likely that the common ancestor certainly the common ancestor of all current animals that have nervous systems, it probably looked a little bit like a kind of jellyfish-ish being. No brain, no central nervous system, a more distributed nerve net. But also the common ancestor of all the animals that have left-right symmetry, us, octopuses, bees, and so on. It was probably looked a bit like a flatworm, perhaps, a small worm, maybe some clustering, of neurons in the front. It may have had eye spots. And there are some biologists, Nick Strausfeld in particular at Arizona, who think there's reason to think that no, the common ancestor, that animal living 560 or so million years ago, may have had a brain-like concentration. He believes that because he thinks there's some similarities of design, if you look really closely, between our brains and the brains of insects that suggest some ancestral. There's an inheritance there from a common beginning. But it's a tiny brain. We're talking about something very small. And I think the usual story about why brains become more substantial is just the demands of more complicated action. Integration is good, integrating different sensory lines, integrating your present experience with past experience, learning and memory. All those things are made possible by what we call a brain.
And I'd like to, of course, get to the distinction, if there is one, between consciousness and mere subjective experience. But first, what is it? You mentioned the Cambrian explosion. What was it that changed in the Cambrian explosion that might have led to the things that we will distinguish in a few minutes ago? So in a few minutes, like consciousness and minds.
Yeah. I think this is the right way to set things up, to think of the Cambrian as a time when animal behavior became complicated for the first time and minds began to be present. And I would conjecture that felt experience or consciousness of a minimal kind came to be present at this stage. Now, why did this happen? Well, there's the possibility that an enriching of the oceans with higher levels of oxygen, which happened just before this time, was an important spur here. So a purely external enriching of environments that made a more active life possible. It's hard to do much in a low oxygen ocean, and levels apparently did go up. Probably, so that there may have been a stimulus like that, but the general picture is one in which coevolution began to be a really important factor. Let's suppose, for example, that early arthropods are the group of animals that now includes insects and spiders and crabs and things like that. Early arthropods look like they may have been the first animals to get really active and mobile and interested in predation. There are these giant swimming, don't know how to describe them, sort of alien spaceship-looking predators from this time. And once they start looking for other animals to eat, they evolve good eyes. Everyone else is going to have to respond. There come to be evolutionary pressures on rapidity of behavior, on sensing, on just complexity in how you deal with circumstances that affect not quite everybody. You could do what the mollusks do and just grow a shell and live beneath the shell, and all the carnage goes on around you and you don't have to pay much attention to it. And I think that's an important case. Early mollusk evolution was probably pretty, shellfish dominated for a long time before you get things like octopuses that have given up their shell. And that meant that early mollusks didn't have to have brains that were as sophisticated, or nervous systems as sophisticated as the arthropods who are after everybody. And quite likely early chordates, our group, early vertebrates, which were probably some of the animals who were trying to avoid the predatory arthropods. And they're going to get fast and smart and acquire good senses as well. So it's a kind of an arms race that takes off in the Cambrian.
You mentioned when octopuses lost their shells, and I found it amusing as I was reading to think of primitive octopuses zooming around with shells. And I suppose that this is something like what, I don't know the plural of nautiluses. Do you?
I think nautiluses is fine.
Nautiluses. Yeah. There's something like this. There's something like it.
Yeah, right. And it's not that we should picture an octopus with a shell, but a cephalopod, a relative. There was a period after the Cambrian when the largest and most active animals in the sea were probably sort of giant predatory cephalopods with long straight shells in most cases and lots of tentacles at the end, really big, several feet long and many feet long in some cases. They were vanquished by fish, it looks like, when fish evolved jaws and became more effective predators themselves. And then you have this peculiar offshoot from that kind of cephalopod, the group that nautiluses are a kind of throwback to. You have an offshoot from them called the coleoid cephalopods that become octopuses, cuttlefish, and squid, the three conspicuous cases now.
Okay, so you said that in the Cambrian explosion, minds arise as part of this arms race that you've described. But this raises the question then, what is a mind now that distinguishes it from a brain, and why does it arise at the same time that rapidity of sensory responses is increasing, eyes are evolving, these sorts of other developments?
Well, I think minds and brains, in a sense, they're the same thing, or
Oh, really?
mental events are brain processes. So once you get brains with the kinds of activities going on within them, roughly speaking, or at least in some cases of that, in the more complicated cases of that, minds are what you also have. It's not, the general picture I have is a kind of biological physicalism about the mind, where they're not extra, they're not additions to a biological world. To use a slogan from philosophers back in the 1950s, sensations are brain processes. It's not that brain processes cause sensations, or once you get brain processes, it's natural to wonder whether sensations are added. They're not added. Essentially, felt experience is brain activity from the inside. When you are the system that's undergoing that kind of brain activity. So roughly speaking, I believe in mind-brain identity. Now, which kinds of brains are sufficient for this to apply? What kind of state the brains have to be in with respect to sort of health and activity and so on? Those are, further questions. It's not just like any clump of brain matter that has experiences. But the general picture that I would defend is a materialist or physicalist one, and one that's careful to avoid a cause-effect model for brain processes and mental states. Again, it's not that the brain processes make this other thing, the sensations or the mental states, come to exist. It's that sensations are brain processes as felt from the inside.
So I'm not a dualist or a panpsychist, so I see no good reason to press you on the physicalism, because I agree with you on that. But there is still this lingering question that I have about what the difference is between mere subjective experience or feeling on the one hand, and then consciousness on the other, if you think these two are the same, or consciousness is a subset of the other, something like that.
I would like to treat them differently in a sense. What's happened, when I was a student back in the 80s, it was natural to talk the way you're talking, where the mere presence of feelings of some sort is distinct from the presence of consciousness. And consciousness is a kind of refinement or a subset of felt experience. From some time, especially in the 90s onwards, latter part of the last century, partly just for linguistic convenience, I think, people began using the word consciousness in a very broad sense to include any kind of felt experience. Thomas Nagel may be the culprit. His famous "What is it like to be a bat" paper from the 1970s. He said, you're conscious if there's something it's like to be you. A system is conscious if there's something it feels like to be that system. Now, once you say that, you've collapsed the categories of feeling and consciousness into one. And you might then say, okay, fine, I'm now going to distinguish different kinds of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, or a sort of primary consciousness, a basic kind, and then other kinds, reflective consciousness, self-consciousness. And that's that's a natural response to the broadening. For a while, I used to resist the broadening. I thought that subjective experience is a good phrase for what we're talking about as the basic phenomenon. So if you see a fish being caught, or or an invertebrate like a squid or a crab in what looks like a kind of distress, and you ask, right, is there anything it feels like for the animal itself to have this going on, or is this really just a sort of squishy robot where there's no feeling present at all? That question would now be asked by saying, is the squid or the crab conscious? And I think perhaps like you, I think this is linguistically not ideal, but it's just what's happened. And I've stopped resisting. I've stopped saying, well, we should call this more basic thing subjective experience and reserve the word consciousness for something more sophisticated. Now, I think part of the reason why the linguistic shift happened is the fact that if you're going to save the word consciousness for a more sophisticated thing, which thing is that? What's the next step or the next subcategory within that? And people have various candidates, but none have taken hold in any kind of consensus. So we're in a situation now where the word conscious is just used for a broad conception of felt experience. And when I say I think consciousness probably evolved in the Cambrian, that's what I'm talking about. Because I'm mostly myself interested in the broad thing, to a large extent at least. I think of that as the fundamental philosophical question. How is it possible for feeling to be present in a biological, physical world? The fact that the word consciousness has this broader meaning that applies to that, that's not a problem. We're trying to understand the broad phenomenon.
Right. So going forward, I will probably lapse between consciousness, felt experience, subjective experience,
So
but I think we're talking about the same thing.
I do that all the time myself. Occasionally I think, okay, I'm going to use this word, use the words in a particular way, but then I tend to move between them.
Before we get to octopuses and some other animals in particular, I have a broader methodological question to ask. When I'm sitting across from you, Peter, I think, why do I think Peter is conscious? Two things come to mind immediately. One, it just so happens that I have evolved and am constituted in such a way that I am endowed with folk psychology, and I look at you and I just can't help but experience other humans as conscious. It's just part of my own wiring. Then the other thing that comes to mind is because we're now informed by science, I understand that there are very similar processes going on inside of our brains, and because I'm a physicalist, I believe that corresponds to or is identical to subjective experience. So these are two basic reasons why I think you are conscious right now, even though I'm not in your brain feeling your subjective experience. But with animals, it's a different situation because they have, especially octopuses, which are so alien from us, they have very different nervous systems, very different physiologies. And we can't, I don't think we can attribute the exact same sorts of mental states to them that we can to us. And if you go to perhaps a more radically different or at least much more primitive creature like a scallop that doesn't really have a brain at all, or a shrimp, it becomes even murkier because they lack so much of the behavior that we would ascribe mentality to in order to explain. So quite generally, how do you go about investigating the question of whether some arbitrary creature has subjective experience?
I think there's no single evidential path, and that's just how things are. I think what we're doing is we're putting together continually a whole collection of different kinds of evidence and thinking in terms of a range of possibilities and how the evidence bears on this range of possibilities. I'll take a while and go through some of this.
Please.
Right. So it's reasonable, I think, not surprising historically, that people have been attracted to dualist views, Cartesian dualism, substance dualism. The mind is a kind of extra stuff. When you just think about people as the mind havers and everything else in the world as lacking it, it's not a crazy view to sort of explore for a while. And I think it eventually falls down. The difficulty of offering a story about mind-body interaction is very serious. Once you start to note continuities between us and other animals and other organisms, similarities and differences in behavior and makeup, I think a lot of pressure is put on dualist views from there. Is there a sort of additional soul-like stuff that comes into a kind of concord with not just people, but all the primates or all the mammals or all the vertebrates? What about octopuses? How do fish and birds fit in? What about the fact that we see learning and memory and pain-like phenomena in various arthropods? When you put all that stuff together, it's reasonable to move towards a physicalist view. Perhaps a biologically oriented physicalist view like the one I have, perhaps one that puts less emphasis on the biology, but we're in the vicinity of a physicalist view. Then we have to ask, okay, we look at an octopus and we think, and suppose it's sort of engaging with us, it's exploring our body with its body, tasting as it touches, it's frightened sometimes, it's curious at times, it has a sort of attentive engagement with novel objects, as many octopuses do. There's three options roughly. Option one, there's a form of felt experience in there that is different from ours because the brain's different and smaller, but it's still a version of felt experience. Option two, there's nothing in there. It's like a little, a simple robot, a wholly mindless mechanism as far as the experiential side goes. Option three, we don't have a language yet to describe the other possibilities. So there's, it has, roughly speaking, a mind different from ours. It doesn't have a mind, or it has something we can't really call a mind, but can't really call not a mind, because the language that we're employing here fails to get a grip on the phenomenon. Now, in the case of some animals, I think that third option, or the third category, if we don't have the category of us lacking a framework to describe what's there, I think is a reasonable attitude to have. When we look at invertebrates with simple nervous systems, small snails and slugs perhaps, or small, tiny marine arthropods with very small nervous systems, or animals in the sea like bryozoans that are basically kind of mollusk relatives. They're in the same big group as them, but it looks like they're living in a kind of colony of spaghetti that never moves. It's a plant-like life being lived by an animal, still with a nervous system in there. When you look at cases like that, where there is a nervous system, they have relatives which are pretty active, but they're living this very simple life as far as behavior goes, I think it's reasonable to say we just don't have, we can't yet think very well about cases like this. A sort of presence-absence model of the mind, where you're either in or you're out, or more specifically, a presence-absence or yes-no model for felt experience or consciousness, whether you're either a yes case or a no case, I think it's going to have to go and be replaced by a view that recognizes lots of differences of degree, gradations, what I call a graded presence view for experience. And that's something we can't even really think about and look for sensibly. It's really in a kind of alien realm as far as our theoretical apparatus goes. In the case of an octopus, I expect, I conjecture, I have a fair amount of confidence that even when we have the more sophisticated framework that I think we will eventually have, octopuses will just be a yes case for felt experience and for mind in a reasonable sense of that term. I say that because they have this attentive engagement with objects. There's decent evidence for felt pain in octopuses. A paper by Robin Crook from San Francisco a couple of years ago, which is after the two books I wrote that had a lot of octopuses in them, Other Minds and Metazoa. Her paper from 2021 has changed the situation, I think, firming up the likelihood of felt pain or something like felt pain in octopuses. It's a big nervous system. They have internal large-scale brain activity. You can't do an EEG on an octopus, but you can do a relative of that. And they have what have been described as surprisingly vertebrate-like patterns of dynamics in their brain. Put all that together, I think it's reasonable to believe that there's not a blank in there. The appearances of pain are probably not misleading. Attention is an important indicator of consciousness in us, and attention is present in them. They're probably on the yes side for those reasons. But if you then say, what do I say about an amphipod, a tiny little marine crustacean-like creature, or an earthworm, much smaller nervous system? I think that third category, that we don't have a language yet, is appropriate for those cases.
I would like to talk just a bit about those cases. Let's take shrimp, for example. Shrimp don't have a centralized nervous system. They have these ganglia as well that octopuses have in their arms, if I understand correctly.
I think, shrimp have some centralization, but
I think it might depend on the shrimp, the type of shrimp, because there are these two branches, the Penaeid and the Carneid.
Okay, that's more shrimp taxonomy than I actually know. Okay.
Yeah. So maybe I'm wrong, but we'll leave that for the moment. At any rate, they have primitive nervous systems relative to octopuses on the one hand, or humans on the other.
Yeah.
And you said that this third category, I mean, you referred to them as possibly something like simple machines. And I mentioned that I've spoken to some other philosophers and some other neuroscientists about these topics. People like Dan Dennett or Michael Graziano would agree with you that subjective experience there's a gradation. So it's not all or nothing, but they would probably put the maybe beginning or penumbral region far closer to humans up the evolutionary chain than shrimp.
I don't know about Dennett. I don't know
Really?
about Graziano, but in Dennett's case, my understanding, I think there's two things. There's the question of generosity to the shrimp in a sense, how willing he is to think that they may have mind like be in the penumbral area, as you say. With Dennett, there's also the fact that he is very revisionist about all the concepts we're using here, including the concepts we use for our own consciousness. And I imagine if he was here, we'd find him saying, look, we're asking the question with some pretty dubious framings here. And it's not that I want to be claiming that shrimp are little machines. It's that we're trying to describe a simple version of what there is in us and that is present in the shrimp. And the mentalistic way we describe it, when we're trying to go beyond a behavioristically interpretable mode of description, there's too much uncertainty and imperfection and illusion, a degree of illusion in the language. So, right, I wanted to just sort of indicate that I think Dennett is in a little different place here, but that was an interruption.
No problem. Let me take a different philosopher, Ned Block, who I spoke with recently.
Yeah.
He said in our conversation that fish don't have subjective experience. This is something that
Did he say that?
Michael Graziano also doesn't believe that fish have subjective experience. And what I'm wondering is because I don't want to focus on shrimp, but I just want to understand if you think that they are at least in this penumbral region where you would not be confident saying that you're 99% sure shrimp do not feel pain.
I think there's a good chance that shrimp feel something like pain.
Okay, that's all I was curious.
Yeah, there's a paper by Bob Elwood called, I think the title is Evidence for Pain in Decapod Crustaceans, and he talks about, he surveys various crustaceans in that paper, and in the case of shrimp, the phenomenon that I think he describes, if you put a little bit of acetic acid on the antenna, they groom it. So that's an aversive stimulus. It's an acid. There's a kind of grooming and protection of an affected area that is not strong evidence for felt pain, but it's part of the list of things that when you put them together start to become strong evidence. Trade-offs, wound tending, protection of an injured area, response to analgesic chemicals. These are the sorts of things that you see in the clearer cases like Robin Crook's Octopuses. And shrimp have a little bit, I think, of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that shrimp would be in a category where there are real indicators, stronger indicators, as I see it, than there are for gastropods, slugs and snails, even though I think of them as in the penumbral area, to use your term. In the case of fish, Victoria Braithwaite wrote a book some years ago. She sadly passed away before she did a lot more work in this area, I think called Why Fish Feel Pain or something like that. She makes a pretty strong case for fish pain, where, right, the argument works something like this. What you're looking for is something that's not a reflex. You're looking for something that first of all is not a reflex, a kind of integrated, sophisticated handling of aversive events. And you don't ever get a kind of single piece of evidence that nails the presence of pain down in a non-human. I mean, even in a human, it's very hard to know. But you can have, as you have in the case of fish and chickens and octopuses, a collection of integrated responses to aversive experiences, trade-offs, avoiding areas where aversive events have happened. Trout who've had, I think it's an acetic acid injection in their lip, they sort of rub the area on their bodies, avoid the area in the environment where this has happened. I think analgesic drugs work to change those behaviors. You put all those things together, and I think that the case for fish pain is pretty good. The argument that people have given against it, there was an exchange about this in the journal Animal Sentience a few years ago. The main argument given against it that I've seen is that, well, the brain structure is just, they lack the relevant brain areas. And I think a good response to that can be given by emphasizing the reality of architectural differences across animals who pretty clearly, setting aside pain, are doing similar tasks with different brain areas. So, for example, octopuses can definitely see, but they haven't got the visual areas of the cortex that we have. They haven't got a visual brain of the sort that we have. Doesn't matter. They've got eyes and they've got a brain that's managing those inputs. They can learn despite having different brain areas from us. They can navigate. There's really almost no mapping at the structural level between an octopus's brain and ours, but they can see, they can learn, they can navigate, they can attend. That shows us that psychological capacities of those kinds can exist in brains with different architectures. And then if a person says, okay, I think pain is not like that. Pain requires our architecture. You can't have pain if you lack the structures that we have. I certainly don't, I can't rule it out. I think none of this is for sure, but I don't think that's a it's hard to make a powerful case for that if there are so many other psychological phenomena where that kind of multiple realizability is present.
Hmm.
I'm curious why Ned was sure about the fish.
If I recall correctly, it was some time ago that we had this conversation. It was similar to Michael Graziano's answer, which was that it was a sort of structural argument in this case, in that mammals have the prefrontal cortex, birds have a walled
Similar sort of thing.
Yeah, an analogous structure, but fish lack this. And it's this sort of structure that is required for phenomenal consciousness, I guess.
Yeah, there's a collection of theories like that. When a person comes up with an account of how experience or phenomenal consciousness works in us, there's always the possibility of saying, and you have to have the stuff that we have in order to have this feature at all. Now, sometimes what people mean is you have to have the structures that we have in order to have our version, pain of our kind or sensory experience of our kind. And then someone like me is going to say, sure, there'll be differences. I mean, an octopus is not going to have, it's not going to feel like a human to be an octopus. Much smaller brain, different design, lower degree of centralization, and so on. But there's a difference between saying they haven't got our version and saying they have no version.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'd be pressing. It's, I think, more just as they have their version of vision and we have our version. They have their version of learning and we have our version. I think they probably have their version of experience and we have our version.
Well, I think even people like Ned, though, I don't believe we brought this up, but certainly Graziano, are very open to the possibility of octopuses being conscious. Before we talk about living on Earth, I'm wondering what octopus experience might be like, what it could possibly be like to be an octopus, just given that, as you mentioned, they have such different nervous systems than ours. So maybe we could talk a bit about what their nervous system is like and what it might be like to be one.
Yeah. It's a pretty big nervous system, or big for an invertebrate animal, the biggest for an invertebrate animal, 500 million neurons or so, which puts them in the lower part of the vertebrate range. It's very different in structure. I mean, it's really an odd, even describing it always seems odd to me. An octopus's brain is a bit like a donut with the esophagus going through the middle. And you've got two large structures behind each eye, which are associated with processing of vision. There's a thing called the vertical lobe. The vertical lobe, which is thought to be one of the areas responsible for more advanced or sophisticated processing. It's not paired in the way that the eye structures are paired and the way that the cerebral hemispheres are paired in us. It's a sort of single unpaired structure. And most of those 500 million neurons in the octopus case are not up there at all. They're spread through the body, especially in the upper part of the arm. So it's a more distributed nervous system. So that's what they're working with. What's it like to be one? Well, if we start from the sensory side, I think it's not too hard to imagine some of what it's like to be an octopus, because they're very visual animals, probably colorblind or mostly colorblind. This is controversial, it's hard to be sure, and I'll get to another element of that in a second, but there's no obvious machinery for color processing in the eyes anyway. So good eyes built on a camera design, image forming eye like ours, and they're a very visual animal, probably deaf or near enough to deaf, extreme sensitivity to chemicals, to touch and taste. Although the suckers on the arms are filled not just with mechanical sensors for sort of shapes and surfaces, but chemical sensors. So everything that's being touched is being tasted. it's not crazy to think of octopus's arms as kind of extensions of their lips in a way, sort of enormous lips. I can sort of imagine that. Everything I touch, I taste. I have good eyes, mostly black and white. I'm deaf. Then we start to get to more marked differences. One is the fact that there's no fixed body form, and there's probably a degree of independence in the details of where the arms go. So the phenomenon in which, for animals like us, for everyone, what you sense depends on what you just did, or how you act affects what you perceive. That's going to be different in shape for an octopus, because a lot of its actions are probably, some of the actions, or to a large extent, autonomously determined by the arms, but will have consequences for what the brain senses. So your arm can go somewhere you didn't realize, and oh my God, I'm tasting this surprising thing over there. So the reafferent side of sensing, the effects of actions on the senses, will be different. Octopuses may be light sensitive across all of their skin in a sort of mild or vague, diffuse way. Hasn't been much work, I think, done on this since an early cluster of interesting experiments some years ago. But let's suppose that's still true. So everything you touch, you taste. You've got not vision, but a kind of light sensing on the skin. You've got good, mostly black and white or monochrome vision. And you've got this somewhat unruly situation with reafferent sensing. I can imagine all that, I think. But when I imagine that, when I try to take the next step, I run into a problem, which is because they have a less centralized nervous system, the idea of a single integrated home of experience, here's my experiential profile now, mine, a single one, this is me, that may be under some tension or stress, or that feature of our experience may be transformed or absent in them. It might be something very hard for us to think about, a sort of a more disunified, less self-focused kind of experience. And I think our imaginative projection, unless you think about, possible inspiration from, half asleep states or psychedelic drug states or other drug-induced states, perhaps meditative states, it's hard to think about that less selfie side of the octopus experience.
Well, before we move on to living on Earth, I'm just going to note one thing that I found very interesting about the book, Other Minds, but our listeners will just have to read it because we don't have time to talk more about it. But this puzzle about cuttlefish and octopuses having very short lives, and the reason this is puzzling, as you point out, is that the brain is for it's for many things, but one very important thing is learning. And what is the use of developing so many resources to developing this brain if it just, after 2 years, you're just going to fall apart like these cuttlefish do? And it's quite interesting, your discussion of this. And
it's still puzzling. I don't think nothing new has happened that makes us think, oh, I see, this all makes sense after all. To have a pretty intelligent, big-brained animal that lives such a short life just it's an odd thing.
So I mentioned at the outset of our conversation that there are 3 books in this trilogy. There's Other Minds, there's Metazoa, and there's most recently Living on Earth. But before we talk about Living on Earth, how do these 3 books fit together, and what was the purpose of writing this trilogy?
Well, the first one, Other Minds, was just prompted by meeting the octopuses and the cuttlefish, thinking about the tree of life, that amazing fact that they're so far from us on the tree, but so complicated, and they have that engagement. That was Other Minds. Then it was natural to broaden out and think about more kinds of animals. And the second book, Metazoa, it treats most animal groups. It doesn't have tons on birds, but it has quite a lot on fish and other vertebrates. It has some interesting, simpler animals, corals and anemones and things like that. So it's a broader tree-based treatment broadening from other minds, and trying to do more with the mind-body problem than the first book did. Then with Living on Earth, here I was affected in my thinking, influenced by an idea that Richard Lewontin always pressed upon me. He was a late 20th century geneticist, quite influential in the philosophical side of biology. Also very politically active. He was a kind of a Marxist for pretty much all of his life, even after most people had abandoned Marxist conceptions of things. And in part because of the influence of those intellectual traditions, Engels in particular, but just, in part because of him, he always emphasized the idea that when you think about evolutionary processes that give rise to organisms, and especially environmental factors as being part of that, you should look at the other causal arrow as well. You should look at the causal arrow that goes the other direction. There are arrows from environmental conditions to how organisms are, and there are arrows from how organisms are and how they behave to the environments that they inhabit. It's very much a two-way street. And I thought, right, that's the missing piece of it's not present much in the other two books. So the point of the third book was to firstly go down that road. Think about organisms as causes, not just as products, and then fill in some gaps. So there's a long chapter on birds that hadn't been covered much in the other two books, and then look at policy. Well, then look at humans in more detail than I had in the other books, and then look at some policy questions.
And it's these policy questions that, for me, are most interesting today. I mean, as we've seen, just from other minds, we could spend 3 hours talking about each individual chapter and then some. But it's chapter 7 of Living on Earth, which is entitled Other Lives and has to do quite broadly with animal welfare that I want to focus on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that talking just about the policies themselves is quite fascinating, but what's really intellectually compelling is to come at it from a philosophically informed perspective, which you do in the book. And that means, for me, beginning with metaethical questions, because metaethical questions, for me, are so important. And most people, most non-philosophers, don't even know that metaethics is a field to begin with. So maybe let me ask you just quite briefly, what is metaethics, and how does metaethics inform maybe the ground or determine the ground upon which you have this discussion to come?
Yeah, I welcome this, especially because there's a bit of a tendency, and I read a paper recently by a philosopher who's a friend of mine about the relationship between consciousness or sentience and ethical questions, where the philosopher said, here's some things I think about those questions, which are just ethical claims. And the question, what are we up to when we make claims of this kind? What kind of assertion or non-assertion are we engaged in? What kind of evidence can be brought to bear? What's the role of reason and argument in ethical debate? He didn't want to, he didn't just not want to go there, but when I wrote to him about it, he said, yeah, I want to just allow people to have any views they have on the status of moral questions or ethical questions, but nonetheless be able to go along with the first order, the particular claims that I want to make here. And my response, I mean, this person is very much a friend, but I think, look, it's a common attitude, but I just don't get it. I really don't.
I agree with you entirely.
I think the integration between the question of what we're up to when we make these claims and what the right claims will look like, after the argument or non-argument or whatever has been done. I think the interlocking is very tight. So I admire, one philosopher who I find myself sort of treating as a kind of intellectual foil when I write about these things is Christine Korsgaard, the neo-Kantian, who was for a while my colleague at Harvard. In Korsgaard's work, especially in her recent book, Fellow Creatures, the question of why we should, what kind of attitude we're trying to come to and what kind of reasons are relevant when we make ethical claims, the meta-ethical side, and the question of how we should handle farming, how we should handle experiments. They're very tightly related. Now, she's a Kant-influenced philosopher, and I depart from most of that Kantian framework, but I think that's the right way. I think there's something that's gone very peculiar when there's too much separation between these. So on the meta-ethical side, the picture defended in Living on Earth, it's a kind of, I'll use a phrase from Simon Blackburn, another philosopher I like in this area. It's a kind of non-representational functionalism about ethical discourse and judgment. I don't think there are facts of the sort that some people think there are in this area that we can find. I don't think it's a fact-tracking enterprise for the most, to a large extent. I think that what's basic here, I'll just say a bit more, is the activity of valuation. Ethical judgment's a kind of valuation. Valuation has an essential role in our lives. It is sensitive, or it can be made sensitive to reason and to factual information, especially in the realm of parity considerations. These two cases are similar. You shouldn't treat these ones differently from those ones because of their similarities. There's a lot of factual input, but valuation is its own thing. It's not reducible to fact stating. And that's a version of what Blackburn, I think, is thinking of with this phrase, non-representationalist functionalism. Now, Blackburn's view in this family is tied closely to traditional expressivist ideas in metaethics, the idea that we're expressing attitudes, where emotional responses are the paradigms of these attitudes. I don't think that. I think his view is too close to that earlier English-speaking tradition. And I'm trying to sort of do it my own way, really.
So the reason that I was holding up a finger there was just, I everything you said was very interesting. I just want to dumb it down a little further for our listeners that might not be so familiar with the jargon, like fact tracking and so on.
Okay.
So is the idea, one idea roughly at least, that in the way that you are comfortable saying that there are maybe physical facts about the brain, you're not comfortable saying that there are these mind-independent facts about whether or not actions are right or wrong, or whether there are obligations. So this is a metaethical view, an anti-realist metaethical view.
Yes. There's a reason why in our conversation I found myself using more jargon at that point, which is because this part of philosophy is a bit newer to me. I've spent many decades thinking about the philosophy of mind side, less time thinking about these ethical issues. I'm less good at moving from the sort of internal discussion to a more accessible discussion without what feels like distortion. So I'm cautious about that. But what you said is basically right. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And then just to put my own little gloss on things, you talked about this very important interlocking between metaethics and ethics. And I think of it a little bit differently. I think of it as metaethics really comes before ethics. And it's almost like the bottom of the pyramid on which ethics sits, in that you talked about first order ethical theories. I think, if you don't believe that there are moral facts at all on that these first order theories exist to describe, then you don't even have a basis to have first order ethics at all. That's kind of how I see it.
Well, you've got a basis to have first order attitudes and to express first order judgments as not as attempt to state facts, but attempts to do something else.
Sure.
And Blackburn, who I mentioned, Simon Blackburn, has spent part of his career trying to work out what kinds of assertions and chair thumping sort of expressions of confidence and affirmation make sense if you don't think there are moral facts. So I think that the first order practice can still exist, but it is surely different.
Yeah.
Here we probably agree. It's surely different if you believe or disbelieve in objective moral facts in roughly the sense that you were sketching.
So you mentioned Korsgaard and Kantianism, and I want to move now from the the metaethics to the ethics. And then I don't think you mentioned utilitarianism yet, but Peter Singer, you write about his book, Animal Liberation. He's somebody I've spoken with on the show about these issues as well. And I am wondering if there is a first order ethical theory that you don't think is describing facts, but is more in line with the way you make your judgments or the way you form your attitudes toward right and wrong.
Well, the way I'd put it is, ethical valuation is a form of valuation. Valuation is this broad and basic thing that we do in all sorts of circumstances, and the ethical version of it becomes relevant, especially in social settings, not only, etc. For me, the question, what's the right first order ethical theory, it becomes the question, what's the best, if there is one, systematic account of reasonable patterns of valuation or reasonable practices of valuation. And I don't have a preferred one that has a name. The approach taken in the chapter you mentioned, chapter 7 of Living on Earth, in many places is kind of welfareist. It's a slightly phonetically awkward term, but it's pretty clear what it means.
Uh-huh.
In discussions of farming and the use of animals in experiments, my main concern is with individual welfare understood in a whole life manner. One of the things I found myself reacting against, seen in many discussions of animal welfare in farming, is the fact that killing or slaughter, the final stage, is almost exclusively the focus in quite a lot of discussions. It's taken to be the sort of the big question. And I agree it's a very big question, but the point of, what I try to do in that discussion is think about the whole lives of animals inside and outside of our control. So farm animals, they don't just end their lives at our hands, but everything in their lives occurs under our control. They're born, they live for as long as they live, and then they die under our control. And the questions we should be asking, I think, are questions about whole lives. I think that when you approach things from a whole life point of view, the difference between the best practices within humane farming and the worst practices within industrialized or factory farming, the difference there is just vast. It's an enormous difference, even though there is death at the end of both kinds of lives. You have a difference between a life that's worth living, in a lot of cases, I think in general, and a life that's not worth living. Never should have been lived at all. Never should have been inflicted upon the animals at all in the other case. So it's a whole life pattern of assessment that I want to apply in that area.
Yeah. For the moment then, let's neglect particular cases. So industrial farming or humane farming or hunting or fishing, and just think quite generally, if you're considering an animal, how do you think about whether or not it is acceptable to eat that animal? How would you think about this?
I find it hard to think about outside of the things that you wanted to bracket. So farming is the easy case, I think, because we are talking about an animal whose life we have controlled. And one question we should ask is, should we control the lives of animals in this way at all? Should we just turn away from non-human animal life as much as we can? If we have decided that some forms of farming, including eating the animals, are okay, then the main question to ask, I think, is, did we give the animal a life that was worth living? That's the big question.
And how do you answer that question, though? Is the life of an animal worth living?
Well, in a kind of intuitively, I think, useful, although it's very philosophically questionable in some respects, in an intuitively useful way, I would apply a kind of reincarnation test.
Okay, interesting.
If you could come back after you die as an animal in a particular kind of farming, or not come back at all, just have it end? Which would you choose? Well, when I look at the lives of especially pigs and chickens in modern industrialized farming, the details of how those lives go from stage to stage, I think I wouldn't want to come back at all if that was, I'd rather just everything ended. If I look at the lives of, for example, cows within the best humane farming operations, there are many in the US. I think, that'd be all right. I mean, I will die at the end of it at the hands of these people. Everyone dies. Animals die. That's not the big thing. What kind of life do I have along the way? I think the difference between those two cases is enormous. Let me say something that I think it is answering your question, but it brings in a bit more of the apparatus of the book. With respect to these questions about farming, and pretty much only with respect to the questions about farming, or maybe also the questions about animal experimentation have an analogue here. But in the farming case, I think there are two rounds of discussions that we can have, or at least imagine having, where the first round of discussion is based on this idea of a life worth living. Which animals under our control have lives that are not worth living? Are there any? Who are they? What might be done? What might we decide to do in response to deciding that there were some animals under our control with lives that aren't worth living? I think in that first round, modern industrialized farming is sort of indicted as a abhorrent practice. And even though it's going to be a very hard thing to change in practical terms, that's the goal. Now, suppose we've done that, or we imagine having done that. Then we have a second round of discussion from that starting point where we ask, okay, now that we've gotten rid of the really abhorrent practices here, and there aren't billions of animals under our control with lives that were never worth living at all, what relationship should we have now to the control, to the consumption of animals, to farming practices, now that we've gotten rid of the really awful stuff? And whereas I think that I can imagine convincing a lot of people to agree in that first round of discussion, I don't expect people to agree in the second round of discussion. I think there's a wide range of, this draws on now the meta-ethical picture, there's a wide range of reasonable patterns of valuation that can be used as a basis for policy in those questions. There are people I admire who are sort of abolitionists. They think we should just get out of their lives. We shouldn't farm. We shouldn't exploit non-human animals at all. We should get out. That's one, I think, defensible, reasonable pattern of response based on thought-through valuations in the second round. A quite different response is to say, no, there can be good farming. There can be farming where it's really a pretty good deal for the animals, and it's a good deal for everyone. And death occurs at the end, but death always occurs at the end. I think that's also, I don't expect the first person and the second person to be able to agree, and I don't think that's a problem. I think these are different sort of personal / ecological / sentimental responses where different kinds of reasons are being weighted more or less. I don't think either side's making a mistake. And there's probably a bunch of others as well, but those are two sort of very sharply different ones. So when we get to round two and we can't agree, I'm not very bothered. Mm-hmm. I think it's okay, it's inevitable. We can certainly try. I don't mind when abolitionist vegans want to try to convince me, I still eat meat, trying hard to avoid factory farmed products, but I still eat meat. I don't mind being argued at by people who are within that first pattern of valuation. It's not that I think discussion should end, but I don't really expect it to be resolvable. And I would distinguish it very sharply from the first round, which I think is resolvable. I think basically reasonable people should come to a similar position in the first round.
Yeah, I agree with you about virtually all of that. And furthermore, when I first started thinking about these questions more concertedly, I came to a similar protocol as your reincarnation test. So I agree with you that it's very intuitive. What I was thinking at the time was, let's say I'm considering eating an animal from a certain farm. I would ask myself, or I would tell myself, look, these animals, given that they live under our domain, they're domesticated, they would not exist if it were not for us. And so I sort of asked myself this question: would I rather live this life and get to have a really nice outdoor pasture-raised existence for this many years and then die cleanly, whatever that means? Or would I rather not exist at all? And at this point, when I was thinking about these issues, I thought, if I would take this life, then it is permissible, or I'm okay with eating this animal.
Yeah, it's a similar kind of reasoning. And there are lots of details one can follow. For example, or detailed questions one can follow up. I've stopped eating lamb because the lives are too short. I think the sort of outdoor pasture scenario you're describing, it's a good deal for animals, but there's something odious about cutting it as short as occurs in the case of lamb. So I think that humane farmed beef cattle is a very different proposition, even from high quality lamb farming.
I think this will be interesting to our listeners, but it's certainly extremely interesting to me. I would love to hear more about the particulars of your diet and the sourcing of your food.
Okay. It's not completely stable. I see myself as perpetually within round 2 of those discussions, basically, and sometimes being more constrained and restricted and eliminating more things, and sometimes not. There are 3 cases where I think about things a lot: dairy, humane farmed beef, basically, and wild caught seafood, including both fish and animals like prawns. I think there are reasons to be concerned about all of those, and also reasons to think they're okay. Part of the background here is that I'm one of the people who I think just needs a high protein diet. I wrote something about this years ago, a blog post called Squashed by the Pyramid, where the idea is the traditional food pyramid, very carb heavy, squashed me at a certain point. My health was wrecked by those patterns of advice, and going to a high protein diet made enormous difference to my health. But which protein? If we think about dairy, which is what a lot of people would do if they're making a move from veganism towards more protein, modern dairy farming is getting pretty unpleasant, and it's hard to make it economical and humane in the way that raising beef cattle can be made economically viable and humane. I think in general, and I was sent a paper about this a year or so ago by some correspondents in Europe. Dairy cows in modern industrialized farming probably have lower welfare than most other cows in other kinds of farming. So dairy, it has certain kinds of advantages that people recognize, I think, reasonably from a vegetarian point of view. And I don't eat tons of dairy. I'm a bit wary about dairy. Humanely farmed beef at the moment is a place, I eat a lot of it. There's a particular place in Sydney where I live, which is the kind of ethically most scrupulous butcher in Australia, probably, where I get everything, essentially. And I feel I feel good about eating their stuff. In the case of seafood, here I find myself less stable, partly because I've usually thought wild-caught fish, right? The fish lives its life without our interference. It dies at our hands, but everyone dies. It's a reasonable option. There's a biologist, Cullum Brown, from Australia, who I know a little bit, and we're often on panels together talking about farming, fishing, animal welfare questions. And when Cullum talks about the actual experiences of that the fish face at the hands of traditional trawling type fishing. It sounds so awful. He really thinks there are some special harms associated with the end of life that fish encounter in commercial fishing operations. And when you combine that with the fact that when you're eating fish, it's pretty much tends to be in the vicinity of, 1 or 2 or perhaps 3 meals per animal, whereas in the case of beef cattle especially, it's many, many hundreds. I find myself, I'm sort of turning away from, I used to eat quite a lot of fish and now less and less. So there's a little bit of a narrowing towards what I think of as the most defensible kinds of farmed meat, humanely farmed beef. And that's I eat a lot of that at the moment. So I have a high protein diet because if I don't, I feel like I'm going to fall apart. With a lot of navigating through the ethical side in a somewhat quirky way. I talked about why I think eating lamb is not a great idea. I think beef is different. Cullen Brown and our radio appearances have got me wide-eyed at what happens with many kinds of fishing. And dairy, I think, the only good thing you can say about modern dairy is an extraordinary amount of food is produced by each cow in a modern dairy setting. It's vast amounts. So not that many animals have to suffer, for a person to eat dairy all the time. But I currently think of that as a less good reason to eat that food than the life worth living that the cows have in the humane farming operations case. And there's one dairy that Singer actually mentions in the most recent edition of Animal Liberation, the book called Animal Liberation Now, in Australia, where it seems ethically just 100% as good as you could make it. But trying to get that to be economic is much harder than it is in the case of beef cattle.
I'll return to the dairy in a moment, but I'm always very happy. I am very happy to support in any small way ethically responsible or more ethically responsible food producers. So I would be curious to hear the name of this butcher in Sydney, if you remember it, and what it is about their cattle that you think their practices that are so ethically responsible.
Feather and Bone is the name of the butcher, and they source their products from lots of different farms. So the farms are going to differ one from another, but the people at Feather and Bone, they visit all of them. They can tell you what exactly is going on at each farm. So it's not a uniform practice. And in some cases, the animals will be killed on site, never see the inside of a truck. In other cases, they do. And I think that's an important difference.
I'm curious. I'd like to tell you, I only eat one meat product. I'm leaving fish out of it, but I only eat one meat product.
So leaving out in the sense that you do eat fish or you don't eat fish?
I eat fish because I've been convinced provisionally that fish are not conscious and they don't have experience. So I'm comfortable eating fish. So what I do at this point, I eat all seafood except for like octopuses, squid. I've been convinced that they're not conscious. I eat
that they are.
I've been convinced that fish, shrimp, scallops are not conscious.
Right.
I consume dairy from the only farm in the country, the United States, obviously, that's entirely slaughter-free. So there is no calf-mother separation until the calf is sufficiently mature. All of the male calves, they are castrated, but they live out their lives on pasture at the farm.
Okay.
So I eat dairy from this farm, and I'm very happy to support them.
Yeah.
And then I eat one meat product. So this is not fish, one mammal. I don't eat any birds, but I don't eat eggs. I eat one mammal product, and I'm curious if there's an analogous operation in Australia. Have you heard of this company? It is called Maui Nui Venison. This is a company in Hawaii. Hawaii has a serious invasive deer problem.
So do we
a
little bit now. Yeah.
And up until a certain point, they were being told because they're decimating the landscape on Maui, Lanai, and perhaps another island. And one operation called Maui Nui Venison was given, I don't know, a contract. I don't know how it works exactly, but they harvest the deer in what I consider to be an ethically responsible way, and they sell the meat. So I won because the animals would be killed otherwise. It's almost like eating roadkill, which is not a pretty picture, but at this point I'm comfortable with that. But also I see myself as supporting a much better sort of operation than factory farming. And it's a model that I would really like to see succeed because there are animals throughout the country, throughout the world, being killed. Feral hogs in Texas, for instance.
There's lots of feral pigs in Australia.
Yeah. So I'm wondering so I eat this venison. I get it shipped from Hawaii, which I understand is not necessarily ecologically the best option because of oil and gas, but it's better to me than the alternatives. Now, I wonder if there are analogous operations in Australia.
I think so, yeah. I have sometimes gotten venison, which I think in Australia, which I think has a similar source. I'm curious why you don't eat eggs at all. In Singer's original animal liberation, that was the one exception he made. Mm-hmm. He thought that free-range eggs are fine, even though nothing else is fine.
In principle, I have no problem with eating eggs. It's the practice that is the problem. And what I find very problematic is the practice of chick culling, which, if our listeners aren't familiar with it, as far as I'm aware, every single hatchery, so these massive operations where farms obtain their chickens, the male chicks, millions of them, are systematically ground to death instantaneously because they're economically not useful. I find this practice to be abhorrent. So it's not worth it to me to buy eggs that are part of this system. Yeah. So if I were to find a backyard farm stand where somebody had been raising chickens for a very long time, maybe they didn't get them directly from a hatchery, or if I owned my own chickens that I acquired in some somehow acceptable to me way, I would be totally happy eating eggs, but not when they're coming from this sort of system.
Right, and I don't remember from animal liberation whether Singer thinks that practice is not such a big deal because it's so early and so quick. As a utilitarian, he might think this is ugly, undeniably, but ethically it's not that big a deal. Or whether he took himself to be talking about cases where that practice is avoided. I can't remember which it was.
So like you, I'm a moral anti-realist, so I don't think that there is some fact of the matter about whether it's right or wrong. And I could be convinced otherwise, but at this point, I just have this visceral, this is disgusting, I don't want to be a part of it attitude toward it. So knowing that eating those eggs would make me feel or think less of myself, it's just not worth doing it.
You see it as visceral, right? Once one says it's visceral, I find myself thinking, should I rethink this? Should I overcome the visceral side? And that's kind of a choice, though. Do I want to? Right, because as you say, I might think if I overcome this, it will harm my character or my self-conception in some way. So I want to trust my visceral responses.
I spoke to a Nietzschean philosopher, and something I've learned from speaking to many Nietzscheans is that they have very different interpretations of his work. And the person that I spoke to, when I told him about my attitudes toward eating animals, he kind of covered his eyes and shook his head and said, there is so much suffering in the world. You would be much better off if you learned to ignore it or even to enjoy it. If you learn to enjoy the domination of man over animal, you would be a happier person just because that's what's around us. And I think that that's right. If I were able to rewire myself so that I would feel good about the suffering of animals for my benefit, I would probably be happier, but that's just, given the way that I'm constituted right now, that's just not the person I want to be.
Yep.
So given everything that we've discussed today, and I've totally loved it, I'm curious what the next sort of questions you're going to be looking at, projects you have related to animal minds, animal welfare, this constellation of issues.
The main one is going back a little bit. I gave the Jean Nicode lectures in Paris a couple of years ago, where I essentially did a more academically, hopefully more rigorous, but more academically infused version of the second book, Metazoa, the mind-body book. And it's a condition on giving those lectures and winning the Nicode Prize that you turn the lectures into a book. So that's the next project. And it will be interesting to work out whether my views have changed much since the lectures. I don't think so. So the next big project will be having in press, in print rather, and in the public domain, a more carefully, every loose end tied up, organized version of my treatment of the mind-body relationship.
Great. Well, I'll be looking forward to it. Thanks so much. This has really been a pleasure. I love talking about these.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks for having me on.